Yep, there we go. Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. Memories run deep. What does that mean? That means think about floods. I can remember the 2009 flood in Fargo. So many of you can remember the 1997 flood. That was actually before I moved here. Trees can record floods in their rings, and they can record them, and once they're recorded, they stay there. Whether that flood happened in 2009, 1997, or 1826. 1826 was a massive, massive flood. We know this in Winnipeg. We know this from journals, people's journals. Winnipeg was, I believe, settled around 1811, Selkirk settlement. And the water never went down all summer. And we know this from what people said, but we also know this from trees, from tree rings. The ring for 1826, you can see, is different from its neighbors. Beside it, in this case, it's smaller. There's also, in the early part of the growing season, very small cells. We can use this to figure out how widespread this flood was. And after the 1997 flood, a group from Canada, Scott St. George, Eric Nielsen, did a bunch of work on the Red River, on the Assiniboine River in Manitoba to develop a tree ring network. And so they could see how widespread that flood was. However, we didn't have that same information here on the US side of the border. So Scott St. George was a young kid then, I like to say that, and now he's a professor at the University of Minnesota. And together, he and I put together this project. We want to thank the National Science Foundation for funding it. And we're looking for evidence of the 1826 flood on the US side of the river. Oops, maybe, okay. Briefly, funding came in late 2018. We started out 2019 was a little slow, 2020 was a little quicker, and this last summer was busy. So we got students, of course, because they're young and strong. This is Matt Schlotterath, and we cored a bunch of trees. And Matt did, I do say we because I did help out here. It wasn't just Matt, but boy, it's good to have those young people with good upper body strength. And we cored a bunch of oak trees. And we found old log cabins or log barns or granaries that are still around. And with landowners' permission, we got samples from those. And then we also looked for what are called subfossil logs on the river. Subfossil logs are those that were buried in the sediment, they're sticking out, and we don't know how long they've been buried. It could be 20 years, it could be 200 years, it could be 600 years. So this photo is from that 1997 or that late 1990s work in Canada. And you know, this was me on July, I think 3rd. That was a tough day. Yeah, in the sediment. It wasn't just the log that was buried in the sediment. That was a tough day, but a fun day. And then sometimes we actually got in the river. This log was very interesting. We were looking for logs. We were on the river 5 or 6 hours. I was getting tired. We saw just a little bit sticking up. So we went over to it, we checked it out, and I cut off a little piece of it, and it was black. And that told me that that log had been buried for several hundred years. We didn't know how long, but we took it and took it as a sample. And Matt was a real trooper, and he got right into the river. So thank you, Matt. And what we accomplished in this, I'm giving a very quick overview. For modern standing trees, notice I have a star there for where Fargo is, little pins there at the south end of the basin in Wahpeton, at Breckenridge, and then another pin at the north end at the border up in Pembina and St. Vincent. And for standing trees, we got at 14 sites, we had 52 trees, and we try to get two cores per side of the tree, or sorry, 2 cores per tree. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And so we got 79 radii, 79 sides, I'll say. The oldest one dated back to 1733. This was actually a tree that was killed after the 1997 flood, or died after the 1997 flood in about 2000. And you'll also notice most of our samples were in the Fargo-Moorhead area, maybe a little bit further north. but we're looking for 1826. Just so you know, the vast majority of the trees date back that we find here in the Red River Valley, or at least the US portion of the Red River Valley, date back to about the 1870s. Only 14 were before 1870, only 9 dated back to before 1860. And to that 1826 date, we only found 7 trees. I mean, we're grateful, we're glad we found them, but that's all we find. So it's hard to find these trees. We spent a lot of time looking for old trees, and we found a few. So then let's look at log cabins. We looked at those. This is the Birdquist cabin on the north side of Moorhead, Minnesota. Now these, we got a bunch that was a little more spread out. We went farther south from Fargo-Moorhead. We went much farther north, and we were able to find quite a few buildings. 18 sites, at least 20 buildings. It's real interesting because sometimes there were 2 buildings on a site. Sometimes we had access to one of them. Sometimes there was a second building, but it was built from the first building, but we're not really sure. So these are estimates. But we looked at 148 different radii, okay, from these, and the oldest ring went back to 1601. There was a site near Shelley, Minnesota. The cabin was falling down, and they were getting ready to burn it. The landowner said, take whatever you want, and we did. And these were the oldest trees. That tree was cut after 1876. It was 275 years old when it was cut. It was just amazing. And there were a bunch of trees from this site that dated back into the 1600s. It's fantastic. And we also were on the Red River this summer looking for logs like this, either those that were buried, not just buried in the riverbank, but those that were buried in the river itself, or at least underwater. I was, from my own research, you know, the drought was great for us. I don't want to say that too loud because I know a lot of people are trying to make their living, and they need that water. And I felt bad for them, but you know, for us, it was actually a bit of a godsend. So we're looking for logs like this. What did we accomplish on the river? We did 300 miles on the river this summer. It was a great summer. I had a blast. It was a lot of hard work too. It was a great summer. It was a terrible summer. But we did a little over 300 miles this year. We did 24 miles last year, which leaves 67 miles left. We hope to do that in 2022 if we get a little bit of additional funding. Should take about 6 or 7 days. Shouldn't take that long. What did we accomplish? We got about 250 samples on that 340 some miles of river between the 2 years. We're still analyzing all these samples. That's a lot of stuff to go through. We got about 30 or 40 of them done. Roughly 10 of them are likely to be very old. What do I mean by very old? Okay, this is a modern log. What color is that? You see it's kind of that orange brown. You may or may not be able to see this. The rings are big. A lot of our modern trees have very big rings, and so the older ones, those that predate 1880 or so, the rings are a lot smaller. I don't think it's a climate thing. I think it's more that the forest was more dense. I think after European settlement here, the trees were a little more open grown and they grew faster. So old trees, or very old logs, those are the ones where you cut a cross section, you see they're black. That one where Matt got in the river, that's red 55 there on the lower right. We actually spent a little bit of money and had that carbon dated, and that dated back to the 1600s. And we have about 10 of these. Red 70 went back there later in the summer and got the whole log. I can't wait to really analyze this. Right now, these are drying out, but we've got some data. We've got samples and we have data. What did we find? At least from the log cabins and the trees. Okay, how many of them showed an 1826 flood ring? Overall, 34 of them, out of 164 samples, 34 of them showed that 1826 flood ring. We found it. Okay, we know the 1826 flood occurred on the US side of the Red River. I want to point out that red one. Shelley, Minnesota, about roughly halfway between Fargo and Grand Forks. 28 of those came from that one building, 28 of the 34. So the flood was pretty big right there, and maybe a little bit further south as you go upstream towards Georgetown, Harwood. Fargo Moorhead, we actually found one sample, both sides of it showed a flood ring for 1826, and we only found this like 2 months ago. We're really excited about that. But you go north from there, north of Grand Forks, nothing. You go south of Fargo Moorhead, nothing. We're looking for it. We're not finding it. I can't wait to get out on the river and hopefully find more logs, but also look at some more information from log buildings. So we found it. There were a couple other floods. 1852 was another big flood, kind of the second biggest, and that showed up as well. But again, the majority of it was right in that area between Fargo and Grand Forks. And we think there might have been a flood in the 1620s, or two floods, I should say, but our sample size at that point, we've only got 3 samples that date back to 1620s. Okay, 2 out of the 3, that's great. Let's get a few more samples before we can really say there was a flood back then. So our overall chronology went from 1601 to 2019. We've looked at over 32,000 rings, and actually we've already started, like I said, our analysis of those samples from the river. So we could probably add a couple more thousand rings to that. We're getting there. We're really excited about this. This has been a great project. And what do we have planned for 2022? I got 67 more miles to go. By the way, I do want to say thank you to all the landowners who've let us land our boat there on their property, either launch or land, just tie up. They've been very helpful. There's only been 1 or 2 that have declined our request. The vast majority of them have said, yeah, that sounds great. Let us know what you find. So I got to follow up with those folks. We're still searching for log cabins. This was great. I stopped at a farmstead outside of Neilsville, Minnesota. Anybody know where Neilsville is? Okay, 1 or 2. All right, very good. Just to chat with the folks to see if maybe I could land our boat there. And I was telling them about our project, and I said, we're always looking for log cabins. They said, oh, well, we got one in the backyard. Do you want to see it? Yeah, I do. That'd be great. So I was very excited, and I look forward to visiting with these folks some more and learning more about this cabin, this site, its history, and hopefully we can find more information about flooding on the Red River. Looking for old trees is kind of a lower priority for us. We just don't think we get as much bang for the buck. We have found some, and that's great, that date back to 1826, but they're so few and far between. And let me tell you, coring a tree, an oak tree, is tough. You're all more than welcome to come out and join us. I'll put you to work. It's a lot of fun. Okay, and I got a lot of samples to go through. Okay, we collected several hundred samples and we're slowly working our way through them. Okay, and this is all what we've been doing. What about the University of Minnesota? Very briefly, their portion of it. One of the reasons we can tell there's been a flood or how it's shown up in the tree rings is the size of those cells in the early part of the growing seasons. It's as simple as that. And sometimes you can tell by eye that they're substantially smaller. But sometimes you can't. So the University of Minnesota portion of this project is they're working with some software, some image analysis software to try to find a quicker, easier way to determine this. And maybe the computer can see things that we can't with our eye. They've had some issues, of course, with COVID. They didn't have as much access to the university as we did in North Dakota. And of course, we were outside for our portion of it being on the river. So we didn't lose too much time to COVID. So that's what they're planning to do in 2022. Again, if we can hopefully get a little bit more additional funding. And I flew through it. So thank you. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them as best I can. And if you know of any log buildings, please let us know. We're always looking for more. Thank you.